Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the 5th episode of the 2nd season of the Center's Religion and series, and our first episode for 2022. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America. The 4th episode, which happened in December, was a dynamic and thought-provoking discussion on religion and the Supreme Court, where we discussed the relationship between religious liberty, the Supreme Court, and judicial activism. We are so appreciative of the comments and the feedback that we have received from our viewing audience. Our future episodes, in many ways, are in response to these comments, and we are currently planning the Center's upcoming biennial conference in light of your comments and your feedback. We see Religion and this series as an opportunity to test and amplify topics that we will discuss at our biennial and to wrestle with these themes and topics with an engaged and a diverse group of scholars and practitioners throughout the year. So for those of you who do not know about our biennial conference, please be on the lookout for information about the conference via our website and our social media channels. But it's a time for scholars from all across the country and around the world to come together and talk about religion and American culture here in Indianapolis. I also want to remind folks that you can return to episodes from the beginning of this year and even from last season. All of the episodes and clips from those episodes are available on our center's website and on our YouTube channel. And I want to thank especially the scholars who took time out of their schedules last month: Sally Barrington Gordon, Art Farnsley, Beth Kate, and Fred Smith Jr. Today, we are turning to religion and animal and food justice. So I'm so excited that we have a dynamic group of thinkers and scholars and practitioners who are here to join us. In this time of planetary crisis and pandemic, it is critical to address the questions about overlapping and multi-species injustice. Some of these are new terms that I'm learning, but terms that I'm really excited that we're going to dig in and unpack today. This episode this afternoon will interrogate issues about food accessibility and about the frontline communities around and who are impacted by climate change, specifically those communities who bear the brunt of environmental degradation and pandemics and those industries that are most responsible for contributing to them. I am so excited that we brought together a diverse panel and a diverse group of thinkers to help us think about the histories of these activist communities, to engage and dig deep into the relationship between activism and religious institutions, and to also think more fully about the intersection and the relationship between religion, animal rights, and food justice. So I am just excited. So I want to jump right in. But before I jump in and introduce our host for today's discussion, I want to remind folks that today's session, we are asking folks to submit your questions through the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom. I know we've been using Zoom for the last 2 years, and many of us know that, but please drop your questions for the panel into the Q&A feature. You can use the chat feature to talk or to engage on the side, but please use the Q&A feature to drop in questions for our host. Now, let me introduce the host for today's conversation. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Andrea Jain, who is my colleague and who's a professor of religious studies at Indiana University in Indianapolis, and she's also the research affiliate at Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. She is an editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and she's the author of Selling Yoga from Counterculture to Pop Culture, and her most recent book, Peace, Love, and Yoga, The Politics of Global Spirituality. Jane's current work, or Andrea, as I call her, include the documentary film that she's going to hopefully talk a little bit about this afternoon, which is looking at this topic of animal and multi-species justice and injustice. And she has been pushing scholars and thinkers alike inside of the Religious Academy and outside to think about what it means to center equity and multi-species justice issues at the center of their research and their scholarship, especially in the midst of what we are understanding as a pandemic and as a larger planetary crisis. So I am so excited to introduce to some and to bring to the fore to others Dr. Andrea Jain. In addition to Dr. Jain, we have Dr. Jonathan Sparks Franklin, who will be one of our hosts for this afternoon. Hey, Jonathan. He has a PhD in religious studies from Indiana University, an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, and an MTS from United Theological Seminary. Jonathan has been teaching at the theological department at Xavier University, and he's also the director of adult education at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Springboro, Ohio. His most recent contribution in terms of a scholarly contribution was in the Routledge Handbook of Vegan Studies, where he has a chapter entitled Veganism in Critical Animal Studies, a Humanist and a Post-Humanist Perspectives. And we are very excited for Jonathan to join us and to be a part of this critically important conversation. I'm going to hand it over right now to Jonathan and to Andrea to introduce the rest of our panel and to begin this very important conversation.
Thank you, Joseph, so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and such a real honor to be here with Jonathan and with our panelists, Chris Carter and Laurie Beeman. So I want to start by introducing our two panelists, just give you a little bit of background on who they are, and then I'll start off the conversation with a question, and I have no doubt that we will easily keep the conversation flowing for the next hour or so with everything that our panelists have to offer on these topics of animal and food justice. So to start, I'll introduce Dr. Christopher Carter, who's an assistant professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego, and the author of a recent book, The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice, which was published at the University of Illinois Press in 2021. He's also on the board of directors of Farm Forward, an anti-factory farming nonprofit. And he's a commissioned elder with the United Methodist Church. So welcome, Dr. Carter. Thank you so much for being here with us. And Dr. Laurie Beeman is professor of classics and religious studies and candidate research chair in religious diversity and social change at the University of Ottawa. She's also the principal investigator of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project and author of Deep Equality in an Era of Religious Diversity with Oxford University Press, which was published in 2017. So again, welcome Drs. Carter and Dr. Beeman. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for joining me as a co-host. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'd like to start with the big recent development in this conversation on food and animal justice and their intersections. The publication of Dr. Carter's book, The Spirit of Soul Food. I thought that might be a good jumping off point for us to address these intersections. Why animal and food justice, Dr. Carter? Where do these two areas intersect?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for actually, I think starting with this question really does set the stage for what I think could be a really interesting way to think about the intersections of food and animals. But for me, I would say that, this wasn't something I came to quickly. It wasn't something I grew up thinking about. I grew up in semi-rural Michigan. I'm from Battle Creek, Michigan, pretty small town. And I think over time, as I began to make the connections between the experiences of particularly my grandfather, who was a migrant picker from Mississippi, grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi and Louisiana, and his experience as a farm worker, and sharing those stories and the fact that he wanted in his ideal life vision for himself was to own land and to be a farmer. But he was driven north a little bit later than what we might call the Great Migration because of issues of racism. And that's a story we can share if it makes sense down the road. But literally, he was driven north. He had to escape because of some racist persecution. And so he worked at a factory. And so he, in his stories and sharing about growing up, I think I was able to see the intersection between his experience as a farm worker, the experiences that I saw of farmer exploitation, and going to graduate school in California in ways I hadn't thought about, and seeing what was happening in kind of the central parts of California. And then also seeing how the kind of reasoning and logic that was used to justify this kind of dehumanizing oppression was often tied up with and wrapped up with the language and logics of animality. this idea that people were deemed as chattel or as less than human or less human, and that their humanness was dictated by their capacity to perform whiteness, right? And so for me, once I was able to make that connection, I could see that the logic, and this isn't, again, I think too new. I think feminists and womanists have been writing about the ways in which the exploitation of the earth has been wrapped up with the way we think about women's bodies. I think this is just an expansion of that to include the ways in which race is a part of this kind of similar construct. You know, Frantz Fanon writes in Wretched of the Earth, there is that he writes that the colonizer always resorts to zoological terms to justify the kind of exploitation, right? And so we all are aware of the ways in which people of color, Black people, Indigenous folks in particular, have been dehumanized and told that they're animals, right? And portrayed as animals in popular culture or visual media. And that kind of response historically has been, I think, to respond by saying, well, I'm not an animal, I'm a human. And what I wanted to do is to trouble those waters and say, well, what that does by doing that, that's a tacit acceptance of the hierarchical structure of oppression that allows, right, the exploitation of people, of creation, right, of beings. And so what you're arguing for in that structure is you're arguing for equality with the oppressor, rather than arguing for or fighting for liberation from the logics of oppression. And so for me, this was just a way to, I think about the ways in which race is structured and deeply embedded and entangled with animality, and forcing us to really recognize that if we're going to address issues of race and racism, we have to talk about the animal.
Right, thank you so much. And maybe if we could pivot to Laurie, or sorry, Dr. Beeman now. I was wondering, you know, I think both of your work speaks to this question, but maybe Laurie, you could start us off. You've been doing work on some turtle conservationists and exploring the ways in which their religiosity is represents a sort of lived religiosity as well as a space of religious diversity. And I'm interested in hearing about how extending the social imaginary to include non-human animals among the communities you all study works. So, you know, I think that doing this is historically uncomfortable for many North Americans, perhaps because the dominant model of human and non-human animal relations has been rooted in ideas of dominion or stewardship. Yet, certain communities that you all are studying have adopted a different kind of model of the social imaginary. So I'm wondering, maybe Professor Beeman, if you could speak to that, and also Professor Carter, if you could follow up.
Sure. And let me say first how wonderful it is to be part of this conversation today. And I come at this from a little bit different angle than Christopher, and I'm happy for you to call me Laurie. It's a conversation, and it's nice to just be in conversation. I am studying, or I did study, sea turtle activists, and thinking about sea turtle, it was a bit of a circuitous route and wasn't an obvious choice for a sociologist, someone who's in a Department of Religious Studies, to study sea turtles. And I still get kind of smiles when I talk about the sea turtle research. But what interested me was, how are people who are engaged in sea turtle research navigating difference between their co-activists? Who are the people who are coming to this? And most especially, my most recent interest is there an emerging worldview that is deconstructing some of this dominion stewardship model that you've just talked about, Andrea? And that was really the push into the sea turtle community. And it turned out it was a bit by accident. It started simply by a little vacation trip to a sea turtle sanctuary, and then a couple of years later in India, being on a beach and someone saying, "Oh, do you want to see what I have in my bucket?" And it turned out it was a sea turtle activist he was also a lifeguard and was keeping sea turtles for release later in the day so that they would be safe. And then I saw an article in the newspaper about Cape Cod and sea turtle rescue that happens there in November and December. And I thought, this is a really interesting thing that sea turtles keep popping up in my life in this sort of unexplained way. And I started asking sociological questions like, who are these people? Why are they doing this research? What is it that it's important about them? And what about sea turtles to them? And what can I learn about religion and non-religion? Because that's my interest, is how do people who might self-identify as religious or as non-religious, how do people work together? How do they overcome difference? And that takes us back to the deep equality piece that you mentioned in the introduction when you introduced us. And so I'm interested in an emerging worldview that, as I said, deconstructs or displaces that stewardship model, because I think the stewardship model is still hanging on to a hierarchy that does a certain kind of work. And I'm interested in whether there is another kind of language emerging, and quite explicitly a language of equality. And are people using a language of equality? How are people talking about their interactions with sea turtles and with non-human animals in general? And one of the findings of that study has been, I talk about it a little bit as though it's in the past tense, but it isn't. But it's part of my research repertoire, but I don't have a lot of time to devote to it. And more recently, I've turned under the Non-Religion and a Complex Future project to community gardens and asking similar kinds of questions about people. And this is maybe where my work more fully connects with Christopher's work in the idea of food security, thinking about how people are engaging in community gardens. And so the emerging worldview that I'm seeing is very much using a language of equality that is encouraging if we need a good news story. It's not a perfect story, but I think there is an emerging worldview that uses equality as a framework, both between human beings and non-human animals. So I'll end there and maybe pass it over to Christopher.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that, this is so fascinating in part because so much of the way in which I think we think about community is wrapped up in our cultures and how we understand the kind of performative nature I talked about, what it means to be in this culture, in that particular culture. So on one hand, I want to say that, Laurie, like, I too have struggled with the language of stewardship. And what has helped me figure out, and I don't know that we have the appropriate word to describe what I'm trying to get at, because I don't know that I think I recognize, because I happen to be married to a veterinarian and have many science friends who are scientists. Hierarchy is a part of what it means to be a creature, right? We live in a world of hierarchy in this universe. It's really, I would argue, when hierarchy becomes oppressive, that's the problem. And I think in Eurocentric cultures in particular, we have a hard time imagining non-oppressive hierarchies because historically those don't exist here, but they do exist in other cultures. They do. I mean, hopefully in a parent-child relationship is the ideal of where we have a non-oppressive hierarchy. That's the hope, but we also know that that's not always the case. And the reason I say I'm still not sure what word to use is because when I talk to farmers, and this is where I think it's really helpful for me to talk, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit, some of the spaces of how rural communities experience this differently, that language still is significant to them. And when they want to grow food or farm food, it's fundamentally different than the corporate model that they've been wrapped up in because of the capitalistic framework that they have been sucked in. So stewardship is still meaningful to them, but it's a different ways in which it's a stewardship that understands a kind of interconnectedness, that doesn't have the baggage of dominion, but that's almost unique, and so so it's like I'm in this space where I'm like, this word has this kind of it brings with it this baggage that we need to leave behind, yet and still there's something there that I think needs to be retained. And perhaps some of that is our own re-education as folks who maybe don't live in these rural communities, who aren't farmers, to reconnect with the land in that particular kind of way, to see where it is we actually belong, right? And that kind of deep rootedness. And again, this is where race comes in, I would argue, because of much of the construction of race within an American framework is to normalize displacement, right? You have, you come to America and you get to be white. you're no longer German, you're no longer French, you're no longer English. That's the way it begins to work, right? Is you have to come up with this overarching framework. And this is why I said these things, when you're talking about animality, and you're talking about ecology, you're talking about food, you're talking about race, they're intersectional. They converge intersectionally, I think, in really profound ways that are often somewhat difficult to disentangle. Andrea, the last thing I'll say before I turn it back over to you is the ways in which I've been able to expand what we might call the social imaginary in terms of community within, particularly dealing with Black folks. And I think is unique to what we do is death. And people that have lost companion animals and figuring out how to grieve, right? Because we don't often, especially in communities of color, if you have a pet, you don't want to be grieving in public. You don't want to make it sound, you don't want people to know you're kind of vulnerable like that. And so I wrote a piece a few years ago called Prophetic Labrador, where I kind of write a eulogy for my dog. And I'm very vulnerable in that piece, where I talk about the ways in which I tried to not let people know how much suffering I was going through in the midst of this, because I'm a postdoc, I'm trying to get a tenure track job, and I don't want people to know I'm going through all this internal trauma, and I'm feeling guilty because I'm not spending time with my dog like I need to, and all this stuff is going on. And what's most interesting, I get more, while that article hasn't gotten cited very much, I get more emails, because it's very conversational. It's the most probably conversational, like non-academic piece I've ever written. I get more emails from people that read that reach out and say, oh my gosh, I needed to read this. This really has helped me, than anything I've ever written, right? And so there's a way in which I think, people of color, Black people in particular, understand that, and they're trying to expand, but don't quite, there's a vulnerability that's required to do it that I don't know that we feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable like that in public.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. That brought up so many questions for me, and thoughts about my own work on the documentary film Predation, where we're working with Black vegan communities as well as sanctuary farmers. And I was especially struck by your comment about normalizing displacement and the ways that has affected communities of color. And then it made me think about also in Predation, our efforts to address the normalization of ownership and possession, and these kind of capitalist ways of thinking about certain communities, both human and non-human animals, and how this is another way that racism and speciesism often intersects in a capitalist world, where both of these, whether they are communities of color or non-human animals, they're imagined, their value is imagined in terms of their labor value, or they are thought of as a product to be commodified and sold. And so I think about, for example, our sanctuary farmers who are normalizing a very different kind of way of talking about animals. The way they speak about the non-human animals on their farms, for example, can be as residents or family members, and how this shift in language around how we talk about non-human animals functions to normalize, or the way we frame it in Predation is it radically reorients us toward non-human animals. And so, yeah, I just, I wanna maybe provide Jonathan a chance to step in here. Jonathan, do you have a question for our panelists?
Yeah, I found it really interesting in both of your initial introductory comments. You mentioned that you didn't begin or set out to do this work, that you kind of stumbled into it for various reasons. And I think that speaks to the fact that, while it's growing, animal studies, animal ethics, food studies, it's still relatively, marginal, a smaller discipline. So I was wondering if you could both, and maybe we could start with you, Christopher, speak to some of the challenges of working in, a more kind of marginalized, smaller discipline, and also maybe talk a little bit about the ways that you see possible ways that we can get other scholars in our disciplines to begin taking these topics more seriously as kind of sophisticated sites of inquiry.
Yeah, so for me, I think the challenge I had was recognizing that within my own particular field of mostly focus on, Black theology and theological ethics, that people would feel as though it was distracting from larger social issues that I need to be attended to as a Black man, right? That they were like, we don't have time to worry about the environment as much. I mean, now you don't hear that as much, even though that is definitely within the background. Like that's not explicitly being said, but implicitly, there's still, I mean, I was the chairperson of religion and ecology for AAR, for which is the American Academy of Religion. So this is the primary organizing body within North America for religion scholars, and just a handful of other Black scholars, a few more scholars of color, but it's still something that's not actively pursued by many Black scholars, because you do get a particular kind of pushback on, well, what are there are other issues we should be focused on. And I think this is where I think given the urgency of climate change, and that's kind of what I always keep coming back to, given the urgency of climate change, I'm literally looking at a copy of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Storks. I'm teaching it in one of my environmental studies class right now. Like if you read that book, I mean, it doesn't, she writes it, it's supposed to start in 2023, but it feels like it could be right now. And she wrote this in the 90s. And I think that's what has helped me kind of have some confidence in what I'm doing, is saying, okay, no, this is appropriate, this is right, this is important, and it needs to be done. So I think that's been my initial pushback, and how I've pushed back on that, and how I think I've been able to invite other folks to take this seriously. And I'm really curious to how Laurie's gonna answer this question, because my answers are so specific to Black communities, and my experience has been, typically, broadly speaking, white folks tend to be more open to this. Is I've had to help people reconnect to the history of animalization and dehumanization of Black folks through visual media, and talk about the way it's important for us to heal that trauma. So compassion is really important for the way I approach this work, because often I would say Black communities typically avoid some of these topics because it brings up that trauma of slavery. It brings up the trauma of being a kind of migrant worker like my grandfather. Brings up the trauma of the ways in which we were people who could work the land but never owned the land. And I think it has been easier for us to kind of set that aside, or say we don't want to go backwards, we need to move forwards. And so what I try to do, and what I do in my book, is try to cast a vision of recognizing that our people, Black people, we're an agricultural people. Like we were enslaved because of our agricultural acumen, our culinary acumen, because our acumen with animal husbandry. I found essays where enslavers would say, hey, if you're going to be cultivating rice, you want to buy Black people from this tribe, and they sell them during this time of the year, right? Like they were that specific, right? And so that's our knowledge that was used and exploited for their gain, but it's still our knowledge. And so it's like reclaiming that, owning that, and saying, yes, slavery is a part of our story. It's a part of our agricultural story. It's a part of the ways we think about food, but it can't be the defining moment. It's a part in a longer story. So giving people the broader history of that has been really helpful for me to bring some folks along. And it's not been easy. And so I'm definitely curious how Laurie is going to answer this question. Now, I know it's not easy for her either, but it's just differently hard.
Thanks, Christopher. And I think, one point of commonality we may have on this is that linking to, I think the way to handle this in terms of bringing people on board is linking to broader patterns of injustice. And your work certainly is doing that really, really well and really effectively. I do think not being taken seriously. When I told people I was doing research, so I characterize the research on sea turtles, and I call it the turtle research. I've just come to do that, and there is always a moment of hesitation in any audience except this one, because we're all on the same page in this regard and thinking about non-human animals, I think. But there's always this moment of hesitation and kind of eye rolling that implies that this is not a serious subject, that what do sea turtles have to do with anything, including, you know, religion, non-religion, how human beings collaborate, cooperate, where we might find sites of deep equality, where we might expand the notion of equality to non-human animals, and so on. And so we just have to keep bringing people back into broader patterns of injustice, and thinking about, you know, sociology of religion has really ignored non-human animals. And sociology more broadly. I mean, certainly environmental sociologists and so on, but it gets bracketed. And it astounds me if you think about, for example, the cat who was parading across as soon as you said it was okay that she be here, you'll note that she's disappeared. But as soon as we think about the ways in which our lives are imbricated with non-human animals, and I've done this as a thought experiment on some days just to make myself think of every instance my life might be organized by a non-human animal, by my experiences in nature. And I know that's a highly problematic word, but we're just going to bracket that for a moment. The absence of that in our social theory and in what we're in our sort of daily analyses astounds me. And so we just keep bringing it back in. We keep bringing the discussion back in. For me, non-human animals relate directly to climate change, and I think for you too, that we're thinking about this in terms of broader hierarchies. Now, Christopher, we might have to have a more protracted discussion about stewardship, because I'm not sure that I agree with you, and I understand what you're saying about that, but I do think that language can, and maybe we can reclaim it. I remain open to that, and I appreciate your opening that as a possibility, because I've had discussions with various nature conservation groups, and they use the word stewardship. I had a big debate with a friend who runs a salmon conservation organization. He used the word stewardship unproblematically, and I said, think about that for a minute. Just critically analyze it. Now, maybe we can critically analyze it and reclaim it. I don't know, but taking us back full circle, patterns of injustice, I think, are the ways to link. You know, as scholars, we're trying to link what we're doing to the climate crisis. This all relates to how do we think about the world around us and how we behave toward it, including other human beings and non-human animals. So I think we maybe can meet on that point.
Yeah, I'll just add there that that's a point that Jonathan and I have spent some time thinking about with the documentary Predation. We've been thinking about connecting animal justice and food justice through a critique of industrialized animal agriculture and the violence it does to both communities of color and non-human animals, and more broadly to the environment. And so thinking about questions around environmental justice and environmental damage and how that unequally affects certain communities, both human and non-human animal. Thank you for that, for both of those explanations. I am interested in this idea of, you know, multi-species justice and multi-species injustice. And I'm wondering if you could each speak to how the communities you study or write about imagine or enact forms of multi-species solidarity.
Yeah, no, that's such a great question, because I don't know that I can necessarily explicitly say this is where I see multi-species solidarity on one hand in one community that I work with. So within the Black vegan community out here, that's a very obvious, you know, to an extent, I would say it's a pretty obvious way that they engage, recognizing that these oppressions are interconnected. But I would say where I have seen and where I continue to see encouraging signs of what could become multi-species solidarity is also going back to the industrial agriculture. And so working with communities in North Carolina, especially, who, again, these communities are communities that suffer disproportionately from the impacts of slaughterhouses. You know, one of my students in the class I was just talking about, he's from Smithville, Virginia, and he talks about growing up in the city where that plant runs the city and the impact that has on the community and the kind of health and repercussions they've had. And we've had great conversations about what he's going to take back home. But where I would say I've seen this kind of solidarity, or the beginnings of it, is the questioning of the kind of placement of these facilities, and how placement in these communities that are predominantly people of color, how they disproportionately impact people of color, how the people who work there suffer from a kind of racial caste hierarchy, where people of color, particularly Black people, are doing the worst jobs and the white people are the managers. And so it's creating this kind of awareness in the conversation that I'm having, that this is done, it's very much done intentionally, because they fall within the same kind of hierarchical structure of oppression, because of the ways in which race and the construction of race is wrapped up with the construction of the animal. I think the challenge that I am currently still finding is that I'm able to work with communities. I want to name one, the Black Church Food Security Network, who kind of operates out of Baltimore, Maryland, but broadly speaking in that area. They are able to say, okay, we need to opt out of this industrial agricultural system, because we can see how it's harming our communities. We can see how it's harming our environment. We can see how the interconnection between systemic racism and structural evil within our food system, but making that next step to be inclusive of non-human animals continues to be difficult, because most of these communities that I'm working with come from a religious perspective. And so they're still really struggling with the notion of stewardship, the notion of dominion. There's still, those things are kind of lingering in the background still. And so it's that gradual shift and gradual change that I think that I'm still struggling with in those particular, and those are the communities that I think that I want to work in. I could do other things with communities, or but I mean, those are communities that I feel like are ripe for revolutionary change once we can kind of make these connections for them and with them. And so yeah, I'll stop saying there. And Laura, I'm curious your answer to the question as well.
Oh, thanks, Christopher. So multi-species solidarity. I guess I'll go back to the sea turtle research and thinking about how people are talking about sea turtles and the ways in which they speak about each other. I would say humility. The sea turtle is at the center of this. So when I talk about the word community too, I did want to raise this. Communities in this sense are very amorphous. So for example, I'll use Cape Cod, people come together, they work together in the season when sea turtles are stranded on the beaches and are at risk of freezing to death. So that would be November, December, early January. And then they disperse, and some of them might have contact through the year and some of them might not. But the turtle and the concern around the turtle is at the center of this. And then there are multiple other ways in which they speak about other non-human animals and also each other. And they see each other as a community, but not necessarily in the traditional ways. And I think that maybe it's important to reconceptualize communities as we speak about them, and the ways in which people are coming together over and around particular issues. I think that's one space in which we can see multi-species solidarity by reimagining what we mean by community. And we don't always have to do that, but I think it's important to expand the notion of community to include those people who come together on particular sites and issues over a particular perhaps period of time or not. So that's one space. And then the other space is this, and again, community gardens also, this project in the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project, which is, we're just data collecting right now. And so I can't tell you a lot about what we're finding because I don't actually know what we're finding, but I've read some of the interview transcripts. I've done some of the interviews myself, and thinking about the ways in which people are speaking about their experiences in the gardens with each other, with other human beings, but also again, thinking about the rules of the gardens, organic only, no pesticides, and so on. And then the ways in which they talk about various other beings in the garden. And sometimes they cause a great deal of angst, those other beings. And sometimes they're seen in more positive ways, but also the ways in which people are navigating that and trying to think, as a human being, I just don't have the right to kill this thing because it annoys me. So the development of a language that is much more egalitarian, much more, I would use the word respectful, trying to sort out how it is that we can build a community on a different ethos, in a different way, in a way that is not engaging with that hierarchical, I am human and I'm a particular kind of human in some cases, therefore I have the right to. So dismantling that and creating a more horizontal space in which people, humans and non-human animals relate, is one of the ways in which I'm seeing possibilities for. And Christopher, I really like the way you said that. It's the possibilities for, not necessarily fully formed or developed, but where are the spaces where we might have some hope? Where are the spaces where we might say, I can see something happening here. I'm not sure what it is, but it's promising. So thank you for that.
Laurie, there's one thing I wanted to say really quick, Andrea. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we've mentioned language a few times, and I think it's so important to hit on this a little bit, because I think language is one of the mechanisms by which we kind of can limit the ways in which we imagine what's possible, right? And I was having a conversation with Willie Jennings, and that's what I'm going to say, because I want to give him credit, because he's the one who kind of mentioned this to me. And he talked about the ways we talk about community, and he noted how so much of the ways we even talk about community are wrapped up in love, as it should be, but the way we talk about love is often wrapped up in ownership, right? Like when we talk about, like, this is my child, like it's a lot of mine. It's so wrapped up in ownership, rather than the kind of solidarity that we all know we actually want, right? So how can we even learn to love in a way that doesn't have the language of ownership wrapped up in there, where we allow for someone to actually have agency, right? Right, in the kinds of choices that they have, where that our love is still what binds us, but it's not this where I think can slip into a kind of hierarchical oppression, where it's has to be uniform, where you have to follow everything I'm saying, rather than giving people space to be and become. And I think that's a challenge we're still wrestling with as a part of the human condition.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. And I'll just say that I think that because because of what you just articulated, any type of consideration of what food justice might look like, or animal justice might look like, or what both of these together might look like, necessitates a capitalist critique. Because whether we're talking about food accessibility or animal rights, we're going to have to address the death-dealing capitalist structures that affect communities of color and non-human animals. All right, so I want to just pause for a second and just remind our attendees that you are welcome and encouraged to put questions in the Q&A. And I'll start watching the Q&A for questions, and in a few minutes here, I'll go and bring some of those questions to our panelists. So please, I encourage you all to consider your questions and put those there in the Q&A for us. And now I'm going to pass it off to Jonathan, because I think he has a question for our panelists.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could both take a few minutes to process the perennial question about the relationship between theory and praxis, or the state of, the relation between academic scholarship and activism. I mentioned earlier, while there's been so much incredible work done in these fields, I still think it's relatively in its infancy. But there's been all this incredible scholarship recently. And I'm wondering, again, if you could both kind of reflect on how we can better implement or maybe communicate that scholar, or what is the relationship between all of this groundbreaking scholarship on religion, animals, food, and activist spaces, and how can we do a better job of communicating and implementing or bridging the gap between the scholarship and activist communities? And maybe we could start with you, Laurie, on this one.
Sure. And let's go back to Christopher's picking up on language. I think one of the things that we are contributing is rethinking the idea of language. And some of that language we think is difficult. I'm thinking here, I don't like doing, I call it bib talk, but I've been struggling with some of Bruno Latour's work and thinking about his use. What is a word we might use, and thinking about his use of the word terrestrial in a way to bring us all back to the ground. And I'm not sure that's the right word, but I do think the point about language is a really good one. And so to answer, I mean, this is a sideways way to answer your question, so I apologize for that. But I do think simply attempting to grapple with the language, we have the luxury of doing that as academics, to really stop and think about what does it mean to talk about the language of stewardship. And I hope that Christopher and I have a chance to have another conversation about this. But what does it mean to use that language? And when we hear, if I may, and I rarely use this word, secular organizations using the language of stewardship, that doesn't mean that it's disconnected from its very Christian roots. It means that Christianity has infiltrated social structure to the point where stewardship has been picked up. And I might argue that. So then to more directly answer your question, I think co-creation of projects, co-creation of research is one way to engage, rather than here's our research, here's our wonderful research, and then over here is a community. It's really being in conversation with communities all along, with potential, I'll use my granting agency's language, knowledge users, but in ways that engage with the issues that are their issues, so that when we are doing research, we're doing research that is grounded in their interests. And my sense is very much from what Christopher has said, that that's really where he is coming from as well, that it's very much in tandem and in partnership. And in fact, just simply the research questions that you're asking are embedded in communities and part of them and coming out of those communities. So I don't want to answer the question for you, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Christopher, to hear your voice on this.
Excellent observation. I was going to say, yes, my questions were mostly given to me by people in my community. And so that makes a big difference, man. Like, I didn't, I would say I was encouraged. I dedicate the book to several people I mentioned in there, my grandfather, one of them, but the members of the first church I was a pastor of, First UMC of Compton. Most of the people there they're either migrated as young children, mostly from Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana to California. And so all of them grew up on farms. And I think those were the people who gave me the confidence to know that the arguments that I make and the solutions that I start providing and start suggesting in the final chapters of the book can be put into practice, because I did it with a congregation of about 120 old Black people. And some people say, oh, you need young people. I'm like, no, you just need like people who believe in it. And actually, I would say, well, older people worked out better because they have the farming background. So in some sense, I would say it worked so much better in terms of thinking. And we didn't grow food as much as we partnered with others who could. And we had knowledge there to teach people. And we did things with food, combating food apartheid in our community. And so for me, I would say, yes, starting with the community rather than trying to say this is my research and bringing it back to the community is something that I have done. But in addition to that, because Laurie, you mentioned that, it's also relationships, making relationships with people who are doing something that is somewhat close to what you're doing. And maybe you see how it could complement and reaching out to them. So another organization that I'm really close with is the Food Empowerment Project in Northern California, who mostly works with Latinx communities. And again, I use a lot of Black and Latinx work writers in my own work, because right now, Latinx communities are the communities wrapped up in farm worker oppression. And so it just made sense to me to reach out to these people and to connect with them, and to allow my work basically to answer questions that they have as well. So it's about involving people and creating those relationships. And the last thing I'll say, and Lord knows this is beyond the scope of our powers, it's about changing some of the structure of the academy so that it actually acknowledges this as work. Right. And so I'm fortunate to be in a place because, and I don't know that it would count for tenure like my stuff does if I wasn't a clergy person, to be quite honest. So I'm at a Catholic university, and because I'm a clergy person, I can say this is wrapped up in my work in the community and so I can say it fulfills the mission, which is the fourth pillar, so I can make it fit. but you shouldn't have to do all this creative stuff to make it fit. Like, it should just be anybody who can do it. And so our institutions have to actually value it, and in ways in which to encourage people to do it. And I think that, to me, is going to be, those things kind of all have to happen more or less in some similar ways for this to really change, for us to get to the point where the work that we're doing has an immediate impact.
To follow up on that question about activism and its wedding to scholarship, I'm interested because you both have mentioned your work on these sort of niche activist communities. But what about larger public conversations or policy debates? Are questions about religion or and food or animal justice a part of larger public conversations or policy debates in ways that you all think are important? Are they, or are they entirely missing from those larger conversations and debates?
I mean, I would say, just briefly, other than Senator Cory Booker is the only one who I know has thought about this, right? Who's thought about and actually had the courage to name it, right? In terms of the roles of industrial agriculture and connecting it to racism and structural racism. But what happens is, if you pay attention to anything he says, like, it gets weaponized on different news outlets, particularly Fox News. They say, like, oh, he's trying to steal your hamburger, or something crazy like that, right? Like, he's trying to take away your meat, and so that's not what he's saying. And so, broadly speaking, it's not discussed, and some of that, I think, is because of the lobbying power of those other corporate industries, in the ways in which they can steer the conversation and control the conversation. And also, I'm not sure that people have made that connection, because to wrestle with the question of the animal and food is to do some internal work, right? To really come to grips with something going on within you. Or how am I wrapped up in this? Because often we like to think of ourselves as saviors. We're coming in to solve a problem, and we think we don't have the problems that we're trying to help people fix. And I think this is where some humility and recognizing, one of the tenets of critical race theory is, like, racism is normal. And so, like, in a similar way, I would say, no, this is just, we're doing the things that we've been conditioned to do. And so I'm not saying anything crazy when I say I do stuff that's racist, because the system is racist, but it's coming to grips with that and say, okay, now what do I do in light of this conclusion? I think it's a challenge that we have. But broadly speaking, I would say, no, it's not in policy debates at all. Laurie, is there anything you want to add to that?
Thanks, Christopher. I would agree with you. I think, broadly speaking, no is the right answer here. I would say that, around the climate crisis, we might see some spaces of movement. I don't think, though, that we're at the point where we're having the kinds of public conversations we need to have around non-human animals. Last week or the week before, when we heard the news of the transplant of the pig heart into a human, it was, at least in the news coverage I heard, it was presented as unequivocally a major scientific breakthrough, very positively. There was no, and it could just be the news sources I was looking at, and I haven't gone deeper in that, but I am interested in that this is how that was presented. It was positive scientific progress. There was very little conversation. I'm sure there has been more detailed conversation since, but it was intriguing to me that was the way it was presented on CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, was the public broadcaster, like NPR. So generally speaking, I would say no. The kinds of conversations that we need to have. And I'm so glad that Christopher and Andrew, you've both mentioned capitalism, because people don't want to have that conversation. I mean, probably even less in the United States than Canada, but it's like, let's not talk about capitalism, but it's the elephant in the room, so to speak. And I think it has to be brought into the conversation. I'm grateful to both of you for doing that. I think it's a very important piece of the conversation. And I think directly explains in many ways why we don't have the kind of policy and public conversation around this issue that we should, and that we need to, and that we're going to have.
Yeah, thanks for that, Laurie. And thanks for using that very recent example of the pigs and the recent development in the news this week because it was fascinating and striking to me. I follow a lot of Black vegan groups, and in those groups, there was a very charged conversation about whether or not we should be growing pigs to use their hearts, and the assumption being that this is ethically very deeply problematic. Whereas in mainstream news, as you said, there was just absolutely no critical reflection on animals themselves and using them in this way. And your comments also made me, both of you, your comments also made me think about the Biden administration and their environmental efforts, and the absolute neglect of animal rights there. And there's been a lot of critique from vegan communities that Biden hasn't addressed industrialized animal agriculture as a contributor to environmental crisis. And again, from a political perspective, it makes sense because, Chris, as you pointed out, this is very quickly weaponized by the right. As soon as there's any concern with animals, it's, oh my gosh, you want to take our hamburgers away. And so it's not surprising that Biden has decided not to touch that yet. From the perspective of environmental science, this is absolutely an industry that's got to be addressed if we're concerned at all about the environment. I want to turn to a question in our Q&A from the attendees. We only have a couple minutes left, but somebody brought us back to language. And we've talked a little bit about how we have to, if we're going to address both food and animal justice, we've got to think about changing the language we use. And so the question was, could you provide some examples of how we might change the way we talk about certain communities that are now talked about in terms of ownership?
Yeah.
Communities of color in terms of talking about the ownership of labor, but then we've also got non-human animals who we talk about as products. Why we change our language to talk about communities in different ways to resist this kind of language of ownership?
I want to say I think it's a great question that I have a very insufficient answer for, in part because as I continue to encounter ways to talk about love, and I have to be conscious to not use the language of ownership. And so it's really trying to work. And so, and one of the question in the chat was around using a different language besides English. And so part of me is wondering if we're living within the constraints of English as a problem here. And I happen to be a person who only speaks English. And I know that's actually, I would say, I'm not proud of that, right? And so I do think some of it was in the constraints of it. But at the same time, I want to say, I am very mindful of when I talk about my son, right, in that way of saying he's my son, but I don't control him, right? There's almost like this shift you hear in the way the way they talk about their children. And I say, and I'm in that part of my life now around people with little kids, right? And so that's where I most explicitly see that kind of ownership language of love being used, right? And I think I was probably more sensitive to it because if you read as I mentioned earlier about going to different plantations and reading the things that were written about when to go buy slaves, reading that changed me to see how many people own slaves talked about, they use the language of love and their slaves and they own people, and how many white people when I go to these plantations still talk about and use the language of good slave owners, right? That's still pervasive. And so it's still within me to know that there's something here in the way we think about love that's very much rooted in a kind of authoritarian God kind of framework, that this person that I can dictate your behavior. And so I'm not sure, which is a bad answer. That's not a great answer, but that's kind of where I've settled at.
Christopher, could I just say too that I really appreciate your bringing love into the conversation today. I actually have a chapter in the Deep Equality book where I talk about love in law, which is a really strange thing to talk about, but love is important to put on the table, I think, and the ways in which it's conceptualized. So if I can take this back to the Latour comment about terrestrial, maybe that's one example we could use to think about how does that reorient us if we instead of saying human, non-human, animal, which is a language that I really struggle with, what if we said terrestrials, which places us then in a very different relationship. So I think it's worth at least experimenting with and thinking these things through. And I think the point about reference in other languages not necessarily being referring to the human, but to the non-human animal is really important. And as you point out, it may just be the constraints of English. But I think we can play around a little bit more with this. I think we can experiment with it in ways and ask, and of course, many people do this as their area of scholarship, but what are the implications of using particular terminology, of using a particular word? And for me, it's been terrestrial has been one that I've really been playing around with a lot in my head as I think about how does that reorient me, and how does that reorient me to the world around me? And it may not be a satisfactory shift, but it's worth playing around with and thinking about a little bit.
Yeah, thanks both to you, Chris and Laurie, for that. I also have noticed that for me, in terms of language, I think that's a good example of where we have a lot to learn from activists who are working on the ground on issues of food and animal justice. And that's where I've learned to shift my language a lot, is through engaging with them. I want to sadly pause now to thank everyone for joining us. And I say sadly because I really wish we could keep this conversation going, and I hope we can in other mediums. But thank you all for joining us, our attendees, our panelists, my co-host, Jonathan Sparks Franklin. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you for the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture for hosting this fantastic conversation, inviting us all to be here. Please click on the link provided in the chat to complete a very short survey. After this webinar, you'll also receive the link via email, and let us know your thoughts and opinions, because the center is really committed to making these conversations the best they can be. Stay tuned for the next Religion and Conversation, which is on politics of the vote. That'll be on February 17th. And the recording of this webinar will be available on the center's YouTube page within a week. So watch for that. Thanks again to everyone. This has been a real pleasure and an honor, really, to be in conversation with all of you. So thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.